Hello, I'm Steve Studebaker, professor of historical theology and systematic theology at McMaster Divinity College. I'm joined today with David Buschart, who comes to us from Denver Seminary, where he is the professor of theology and historical studies. David is here to talk about some of his recent research projects and writing, and particularly three areas of thought that we want to talk about, and that is creation care, social justice, and faith and work. David, tell us about what you're doing in those areas.
Well, I think there are many, of course, implications and manifestations of the way the churches are, in a sense, in the process of adapting to a post-Christendom, some might say a post-Christian context. And I think just one manifestation of that adjustment to that new context can be the recognition that Christians, instead of being, in a sense, off in their own enterprises, so to speak, need to be working, in a sense, shoulder to shoulder with people beyond the church, addressing major issues that affect everyone, not just Christians or not just some subgroup, but everyone. And I think we see that emerging pattern, that kind of an emerging pattern in at least three areas where evangelical involvement has become visibly more evident in recent, 10 to 15 years. Those three being creation care, matters of social justice, and what some people might call faith and work, or the theology of work movement. And I'm a theologian, not a social scientist. So as I look at these movements, my interest is theological. And what I've noticed is that evangelical engagement in all three of these arenas is being formed by a particular kind of theological framework. And that is a framework that some will refer to as the grand narrative of creation, fall, redemption, culmination. And that's the so-called 4-chapter version of the grand narrative. There's a 3-chapter version and an 8-chapter version, but they all have in common that basic narrative story. And so many people involved in each of these arenas who are committed to a biblical framing for the work that they do are finding it very helpful to use this framework, creation, fall, redemption, culmination, both as, you could say, a motivation and also then framing and guiding, informing how they engage in each of these arenas.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, could you talk a little bit more about that last point you made, how the grand narrative, creation, fall, redemption, culmination, how do those provide the imaginative space, if you will, for Christians to engage in something like creation care or social justice or faith and work?
Well, if we use this image of chapters to a story, so creation chapter 1, fall chapter 2, redemption chapter 3, culmination chapter 4. If we just use that for the moment, many of the people who are working in these three arenas, they will say something along the following lines, that evangelicals have been very good with emphasizing chapters 2 and 3, fall and redemption.
Yeah.
We haven't been as good historically with really owning and living in chapters 1 and 4 as well. It's not an either or, it's all of them. Yeah. And so just one very small, hopefully easy to understand illustration of this would be, if you really have a strong view of eschatology, chapter 4, culmination, and if that eschatology is one that sees God's ultimate redemptive work as including not only souls or spirits, but whole persons and even the created order, as I would suggest, for example, Romans 8 suggests.
Yeah, liberation of creation.
if you believe that this is all just going to be burned up in the end,
Yeah.
you're not very likely to be thinking in redemptive terms about our engagement with the created order. On the other hand, if you believe that the created order beyond human beings, in addition to, not instead of, human beings, is part of God's complete redemptive plan, that prompts us to some pretty sober thinking about how we steward this created world in which we live.
Yeah, yeah, those are great issues that you're working on, David. And I think they're vitally important for Christians living in a post-Christendom context where it's increasingly hard for us to see and understand how our life outside of the church relates to God and His kingdom. During a Christendom era where the culture is more or less Christian, at least in an ostensible way, maybe it's easier to do, right? Because you're living within a Christendom society. It's just, so all of your life is in a sense touched by sort of a Christendom culture. But today, where that's increasingly not the case, I know for in the States it is, but here in Canada, we're increasingly secular, multicultural, religiously plural. I think it's easy for Christians to think of the big bad world out there as just that, the big bad world, and it has real no connection to the Christian life. And yet, when we tap into point 1 and point 4 of this narrative that you're talking about, creation and culmination, we can see that in fact all of our life in creation is something that's implicated in God's kingdom. And one of the images I find so powerful in Scripture is the in the book of Revelation, which just whatever sort of bizarre things happen in there, there is this cool, great imagery of God's culminating work, not in, as you said, simply this sort of Gnostic spiritualized space, but the new heaven, the new earth that has a city, and the city being the apex of human cultural activities.
Right.
And these are things that are not obliterated and gotten rid of in God's kingdom, but they are actually renewed. And so that all of life becomes the arena for the eruption, the emergence of God's grace and the renewal that we ultimately anticipate in that new heaven and in that new earth. And so this is very, very exciting and intriguing work that you're working in.